The morning had come up thin and silver over Arroyo Lirio. A hush laid upon the alkali flats as if the land had put its finger to its own lips. Heat would come later like a verdict, but just then the light was gentle, and the wind carried the faint chalk smell of the dry lake. Mesquite put up its little green fists against the sky. Far off, a windmill ticked like a metronome for a slow, stubborn hymn, each blade catching a pale coin of sun and giving it back. Crows pulsed over the basin as one black thought. There was no river, only a suggestion of where one had been, a furrow of pale stones, a memory braided in dust. Miriam Vale woke before the clock and after the world, her habit for years. The house had been built without ornament and kept the same way. Swept floors, straight chairs, the Bible closed, but near. She lifted the tin basin, and the water inside lay quiet as a kept secret. In the top drawer of a small pine chest, she kept a pocket sundial, bronze gone the color of tea, the chain bright only where it had worried against her thumb. Its gnomon was missing. That absence had a weight. She turned the dial to feel the comfort of its cool roundness, then set it on the sill so the sun could find what it could not use. She had once believed time would sharpen by the sheer force of waiting. She knew better now. She tied her gray hair with a strip of calico and stepped out where light made a nave of the yard. Fence wires sang in the faint wind. The gate leaned like a tired man. Somewhere a pump joint clicked and hesitated, the way a heart does when it remembers. She had the kind of face that had ended its bargain with vanity, plain, weathered, not hard so much as careworn. The mouth with its small turn at one corner as though bracing for news. Her hands, narrow and industrious, kept small accounts with the day. Feed, water, patch, carry. She had known laughter that sounded like a younger woman and grief that did not sound at all. She worked because it kept the past from arranging itself too neatly. She did not expect company. Across the flats a rider floated in the heat milk, a dark stroke pulling toward the ridge where the fence fell away to cheat the horizon. Jonah Cates rode a paint with more patience than breeding, his hat brim cut low, his shirt the color of scrub. He did not push the horse. He had learned to arrive as if by accident, even when he meant to be there. Folks in the county called him a fence rider from Malloy's North Range, a good hand who did not set his boots under a table long enough to warm them. He carried a length of baling wire in his saddle roll and a small plane he kept sharp enough to raise a whisper from cedar. The tool had belonged to no one he wanted to talk about. He believed in moving on before any place learned his name. The windmill at Miriam's place ticked through a stubborn cycle and then stalled. An old throat cleared and nothing said. She felt the stillness run across the yard like a dog that had slipped its chain. The cistern would not like that silence. She wiped her palms on her skirt and looked up into the blades, the whole contraption bright with baked dust. Across the fence, the paint horse shifted, and the rider raised a hand, the smallest salute, then turned along the line of posts where wire bowed, studying the sag like a reader at the end of a verse too long for breath. Miriam lowered her gaze and reached for the ladder. She climbed with the care of one who has fallen before. The sun came over her shoulder and put a thin gold burnish on the bronze dial in the window, and on the silver in her hair, and on the welt-white scar across her ring finger where a rope had taught its lesson. From the top rung she could see the dry lake shine and the far road where wagons ghosted their dust and disappeared. A crow spoke a single syllable to the morning. The ladder foot wobbled in the powder, and she felt the shift not with fear, but with the old embarrassment of a body that did not always obey. Age was not a shame to her. It was a ledger with certain lines blacked out. Jonah drew rein at the corner where the brace post leaned. He dismounted and set his palm to the wood as if greeting a shoulder. He could repair a fence in the time it took a story to get around town, and he preferred the fence. If there was judgment in the land, it lived in mouths, not in cedar. He looked toward the windmill and the woman on its ladder and thought of his mother's hands, cracked at the first chill of October, and the look she wore when a chore required a second person, and there was none. He had carried that look west a long time. Miriam got the bolt loose and the vane swung 2 inches, then 2 more. The bearing shuddered and gave a slow, unhappy turn. When the blades faced east, they caught the morning square and the head creaked into motion. Each tick a reluctant concession. She told herself she had done it alone and believed it until the shadow moved where there should have been none. She glanced down. The rider had not come very close. He stood with his hat in his hand as though entering a church. "Wind's kinder if you square the tail," he said, voice low, dust dry. His words carried across the yard like water offered. Miriam nodded but did not speak. Pride had preserved her like salt. It had also made certain meals lonely. She descended, carefully, always carefully. And when the ladder settled, she met the man's eyes for the briefest legal moment a stranger is owed. The windmill turned true for 3 breaths, then faltered. "I have a wrench," Jonah said. The truth was he had 2. She stepped aside and set the ladder again, and he came only as far as needed to reach the brace. His hands moved without flourish. The bolt consented, and he laid the wrench flat like a cross on the platform, as if letting the tool rest its case. The blades shifted, caught, and began to revolve. Slow at first, then with the quiet confidence of a thing accomplishing its one idea. Somewhere in the downpipe a bubble rose and broke. Miriam felt it in her ribs. Across the sill, the sundial lay open to the light. It could not tell her anything new. Jonah glanced toward the window and saw the small bronze circle, the chain coiled like a sleeping question. He did not ask. A man who asked after another's relics made himself part of a story he had no right to finish. He turned the wrench back into his palm and gave a little nod that was not yet a farewell. The fence line tugged at him like an old duty. The woman's silence did not feel like refusal. It felt like a porch with no chairs yet. "Wind ought to keep its promise a while," he said. "It never has," she answered, but without bitterness. The crows rose again, a smudge of moving ink, and the windmill set its rhythm, tick, 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 measuring something neither of them named. He put his hat back on and she put her hand on the ladder, and the day began in earnest, carrying them in separate circuits that would cross again because west of Arroyo Lirio there were only so many paths a human life could take. The sun climbed. The shadow on the sundial moved where a pointer was missing, and still the light knew how to fall. Time kept its counsel. So did they. The afternoon settled heavy and pale, a light so wide it made even silence sweat. The windmill turned slow, its rhythm steadier now, its shadow moving across the yard like a sundial that had found new purpose. Miriam Vale stacked fence posts behind the shed, their ends black with tar. She wore a broad hat, brim uneven, and a cotton dress washed to the color of unbleached string. When she bent, her bones spoke in small ways, but she pretended not to hear them. Beyond the pasture fence, a trail of dust uncoiled like smoke. Jonah Cates was coming back. Not fast, not lazy either. Just the pace of a man who's learned that rushing is what breaks things. The sky had gone to milk, the horizon bruised with coming weather. He rode close enough that she could hear the saddle leather breathe. "Windmill's holding," he said, sliding down from his horse. "It'll hold till it doesn't," she answered, setting the last post upright. He gave a small smile at that. Thin, private, like a man who'd heard a hymn he once knew. "Fence line dropped again along your north lot. Malloy don't send men this far down. Thought I'd mend it since I was already riding." Miriam wiped the back of her neck with her sleeve. "No man rides this far unless he wants something." "Maybe quiet," he said. It wasn't flirtation. It was confession. She looked at him then, proper. Dust on his jaw, eyes pale gray like weathered tin. Younger, yes, by a decade, maybe more, but his face had seen the same years, only faster. The desert does that to men. He lifted a coil of wire from his saddle and went to the fence without waiting. She watched from a distance, feeling the oddness of it, company without expectation. Each twist of his pliers made a small music. When he paused to stretch his back, she brought a tin dipper of water from the barrel and held it out. "Here," she said. "A man don't work in that heat alone." He took it, careful not to let his fingers touch hers, and drank. The sound of it, the swallow, the sigh after, seemed to fit inside the silence between them. "You live out here by yourself?" he asked finally. "Been 3 winters since I buried the last of my kin." He nodded, as though she had told him something about the weather. "Lonely work." "Work's never lonely," she said. "People are." The fence held under his weight as he tested it. He ran his thumb along a twisted knot and stepped back. "Good as it gets," he murmured. "You patch fences like a man mending scripture," she said before she could stop herself. He looked over his shoulder at her. "Scripture don't hold if you pull too hard." The line lingered in the air, soft and strange. She turned away, embarrassed by how much it sounded like an answer to something she hadn't asked aloud. The sun fell behind the ridge early, bringing a shadow that smelled of creosote and old storms. Jonah packed his tools with deliberate quiet. The light had gone the color of peach flesh, and the windmill threw long blades of shadow that crossed them both. He tipped his hat. "If it's no bother, I'll ride through again tomorrow. Want to check the brace once it dries." She hesitated. "Suit yourself." But when he was already halfway down the trail, she realized she had not told him no. She went inside, the screen door trembling against its hinges. The kitchen smelled of coffee gone stale and iron. She poured herself half a cup and sat by the window. The sundial was still on the sill, its face dull, chain coiled. Outside, the windmill turned slow, whispering his name in the rhythm of its blades. For a long while she watched the dust trail fade into night. She told herself it was the fence she was thinking about. She told herself many things. At the far edge of the horizon, a storm flickered once, distant heat lightning, pink and silent. And for a moment, it lit the land the way memory does. Too bright, too brief, too late. The storm never came. It only left its smell, wet dirt without the mercy of rain. The next morning, Miriam hitched her wagon to the old bay and took the rutted road east to town. A barrel of apples from her single tree, 3 jars of preserved beans, and a hope to sell them for enough kerosene to last the week. She wore her better dress, the one with the mended cuff she'd sewn by lantern light. Arroyo Lirio was 1 street and 2 promises. A post office with a porch that leaned forward like it wanted to listen. A mercantile full of gossip priced the same as sugar, and a church whose bell hadn't rung since the Reverend left for California. Women lingered by the troughs, sleeves rolled, trading the same stories till they sounded like psalms with missing verses. She could feel them watching before she'd even tied her reins. "Morning, Miss Vale," said Clarabelle, the storekeeper's wife, voice too bright, too shaped for kindness. "Heard your windmill caught last week. Heard you had help." Miriam kept her hands on the wagon rail. "That's so." Clara smiled the way a knife might if it could. "Rider from Malloy's crew. Younger man. Good with fences." The other women shifted, pretending to check their lists. Their silence was polished and ready. "World's full of younger men," Miriam said. "Ain't none of them mine." "Course not," Clara murmured, eyes sliding toward the sundial chain that hung faintly from Miriam's pocket. "Just saying it's nice to see a woman visited now and then." Miriam turned her back, lifted a barrel of apples with a grunt that silenced them. Inside the store, she kept her chin high and her words few. Bought flour, salt, a little sugar. The clerk, a thin boy who stared too long, tried to offer help loading the wagon. She declined. Outside, heat gathered on the porch boards like trapped breath. Jonah Cates was there, 1 boot propped against the post, a coil of new wire slung over his shoulder. He tipped his hat, but his eyes flicked past her to the women inside the glass, their faces half hidden but full of noise. "Don't mind 'em," he said. "They talk 'cause they can't mend." "I don't," she said, though the words tasted untrue. "You here for Malloy?" Got a list of supplies. Nails, mule feed, patience. Last one's out of stock. She let the smallest smile escape, then caught it back. You'll find that everywhere. He stepped down from the porch, took the flour sack from her arms without asking, and set it on the wagon bed. His hands were steady, not careful like pity, just sure. For a moment the wind lifted her hair and laid it against her cheek. He reached to move it, then stopped himself halfway, hand caught between duty and trespass. "Ma'am," he said, quiet. "Miss Vale," she corrected, though it didn't sound stern. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, softer still. The wagon boards creaked as she climbed up. Around them the town hummed like a flytrap, small, persistent. Jonah's horse shifted, ears twitching toward the sound. "People here remember everything but the truth," he said, looking toward the ridge. "I don't give them either," she answered. When the wheels turned, dust rose in sheets, and the gossip behind her became muffled by the wind. But it stayed, like burrs in a hymn. That night, she lit her lamp early. The room felt smaller than usual. Her shadow stretched tall across the wall. The sundial sat on the table beside her plate, its face catching the lamplight. Gnomon still missing, still accusing. She traced the rim with her thumb, thinking how even a broken clock still tells something. If not the hour, then the patience of waiting for it. Outside, the fence held true under the moon. Somewhere beyond it, a horse stamped once, and the faint jingle of tack answered. She didn't rise to look. She only whispered to the quiet, "Let them talk." And the quiet, loyal as ever, didn't. Days passed beneath the slow wheel of sun and shadow, the kind of days that left no mark until you turned back and saw the season changed. Miriam mended shirts, cut new patches for the barn roof, and boiled jars until the kitchen smelled of tin and vinegar. She worked from habit, not hunger. A woman who fills her hours keeps ghosts from finding chairs. Jonah came at odd times, never invited, never unwelcome. Once near noon, once at dusk, once on a morning so still the grasshoppers seemed to kneel, always with some reason. A loose hinge, a post fallen, a calf wandering from Malloy's range. His reasons were as thin as the excuses men make when they've already decided on something. That evening the air was the color of brass. Miriam was on the porch hemming his coat, the one he'd left hanging over her chair after fixing the pump. The lining was torn along the seam, worn soft with miles. She stitched it closed with neat, tidy care, same as she would mend her own. She did not notice the horse till she heard the creak of its saddle. Jonah stood by the rail, holding his hat like a man uncertain whether to stay or tip his way out. "Didn't mean to trouble you again," he said. "Then you shouldn't have come," she said without looking up. He smiled at that, slow and brief. "Fair enough." He set a small box on the table. Nails, new and clean. "For your shutters," he said. "Wind's coming from the south next week." Heard it on the telegraph line hum. She tied off the thread and bit it clean. "You listen close to wires?" "Only when they sing right." He sat on the porch step. The boards creaked under his weight, and the sound folded into the evening's hush like it belonged. They spoke of small things: the well, the mule, the strange noise the sky makes before lightning. He told her about his mother's farm back east, how the river froze clean enough to see fish asleep beneath it. She told him about planting onions too deep and losing half the crop. When the first cricket began its thin tune, he rose. "Fence'll need checking after the wind," he said. "You'll check it?" He paused. "If you don't mind me doing so." "I mind everything," she said, though her voice had gone soft. He nodded, like that was answer enough, and walked into the twilight. The last light caught on the buckle of his spur, a brief flare like a match struck and gone. She watched him vanish between the yuccas. The night came behind him, patient and wide. Inside, she set his coat on the peg where it had hung before, and found her eyes drawn to the sundial on the sill. Its bronze face glowed faint in lamplight. She lifted it and turned it over in her palm. For a moment, she imagined the missing gnomon replaced. A thin wedge casting a shadow across the table, dividing time into before and after. She whispered to no one, "It's not time that ages you, it's waiting." The wind moved through the chinks of the house like breath. And out on the flats, Jonah Cates walked beside his horse rather than riding it, as though distance might shrink if met on foot. He thought of the woman's hands, how they didn't shake when they worked, only when they rested. He thought of her silence, how it left space enough for honesty. When he looked back once, her porch lamp was still burning, small, steady, and impossibly far. The nights had gone longer now, the air brittle with that certain autumn quiet that tells of things dying in their own time. The windmill creaked slower, a bone sound against the stars. Cattle lowed in the distance, and then forgot why. Inside the house, Miriam sat by the fire with her sundial open on her knee. The light of the flame moved across its worn bronze face, catching in the groove where the missing gnomon should have stood. She touched that emptiness with her thumb as if polishing a scar. There were years she never spoke of, years folded behind her like a dry riverbed no map recorded. Her first husband, Samuel, had died the spring the river failed. He'd been sure rain would come, and she'd believed him because faith is often just love renamed. The cattle had died standing, their hides cracking in the heat. He'd gone out to dig for water where none lived, and he never came back. She'd buried him with her own hands, her fingers bleeding from the shovel. She never wept then. Only later, when the windmill stalled for the first time, she'd cried until her voice turned to dust. That was the wound, not the loss itself, but believing too long in time's kindness. She'd kept the sundial from her father, broken as it was, because it felt like truth. Time doesn't point. It only passes. That evening Jonah came again, leading his horse slow, its reins trailing like ribbon. He carried something in a folded cloth. The porch light caught him halfway up the steps. "You worked too late," he said. "Late's all that's left," she answered. He sat on the step, not asking to come in. "You ever fix that sundial?" She froze a moment. "How'd you know it's broke?" He shrugged. "Ain't casting a shadow." She smiled faintly. "Not everything needs to." He unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small whittled piece of cedar, shaped long and thin, the end beveled to a point. "I made this for you," he said. "For that place that's missing something." She looked at it for a long moment before taking it. The piece fit neatly into the dial's hollow, as if meant for it. "It won't tell the right time," she said. "Maybe not," he said. "But it'll remember the light." The fire crackled inside. A hawk cried out somewhere across the plain, the sound stretched thin by wind. "You believe in second chances, Jonah Cates?" she asked. He thought on it, jaw working, eyes on the horizon. "No, ma'am," he said finally. "Only long ones that never ended proper." She nodded, understanding that answer in her bones. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You ever think some folks just need to finish something they started wrong?" "I think most folks do," she said. He looked up at her then, eyes gray and quiet as a still creek. "That's what I came here for." She held his gaze a breath too long. "Fence won't mend all that, Jonah." He half smiled. "Maybe not, but it keeps my hands from shaking." A gust of wind came through, carrying the scent of cedar from his carving. It mixed with the smoke of her chimney, soft and human. When he rose to go, he touched the brim of his hat, not a farewell, not yet, and said, "Keep that piece. Might help you know where the sun's hiding." After he left, Miriam placed the cedar wedge into the sundial. The bronze caught the firelight, and for the first time in years, it cast a faint, trembling shadow across her table. She stared at it for a long while, afraid to breathe. Then she whispered, almost to the wind itself, "It's pointin' home." The dawn came red and uncertain. Sky low, air thick as wool. By noon, the heat had gone sharp enough to cut the breath in half. Every bird was silent. Even the windmill, that stubborn clock of hers, turned once and stopped, as though listening. Miriam stepped onto the porch and tasted iron in the air. The far ridge shimmered like glass held too close to flame. Then came the first smoke, thin as a pencil line against the horizon. She knew that color. It wasn't from hearth or camp. It was grass burning, the wild, fast kind that travels quicker than prayer. She dropped the bucket she was carrying and ran for the barn. The bay mare threw her head, catching her fear. By the time Jonah Cates appeared, the wind had shifted east, and the fire had crowned the far slope, rolling down in a red seam like judgment made visible. His horse was streaked with lather. He rode straight into the yard and swung down before the animal had stopped moving. "You got water?" he shouted. "Cistern's half," she said. "Ain't near enough." He didn't waste a second. Pulled his coat from the rail and plunged it into the trough, water slapping his boots. "We'll trench the fence line. Wind's driving north. If we cut a line here, might turn it." She was already hauling shovels, her gray hair breaking loose under her hat. The two of them worked side by side, dirt flying, smoke rolling closer with each breath. The sky went the color of old blood. Heat stung their eyes, and the air began to moan. "Back when the river died," Miriam gasped. "I thought that was the worst it could get." Jonah's shovel hit stone, sparks jumping. "You was wrong," he said. The fence caught first, dry wood snapping into white flame. He tore at the posts with his bare hands while she flung wet feed sacks over the rails. The smell of burning mesquite filled the world. At one point she stumbled, and he caught her arm, steadying her. Their faces were streaked black with soot. Sweat carved clean lines through the ash. "Get inside," he yelled. "I'll not watch it from a window." They fought till their lungs burned and the sky became a lid of smoke. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the wind turned south again, greedy for other fields. The fire twisted, hesitated, then rolled away, leaving behind a rim of scorched earth that smoked like the end of creation. Miriam dropped to her knees. The shovel fell beside her with a dull ring. She was coughing, hair clotted with gray ash. Jonah crouched beside her, pressing his bandana to her mouth, his own hands shaking now. "Breathe slow," he said, voice rough. "You did it. You held it." Her throat worked. "We did it," she said. He nodded, though his eyes were still on the horizon where the fire disappeared, silent, indifferent. When the first stars returned, they sat on the porch steps, too spent to speak. Her dress was singed at the hem. His hands were blistered in the web between thumb and finger. The windmill creaked again, timid, its blades bent but alive. Miriam lifted her head. The night smelled of wet ash and sage. "It could have taken the whole house," she said softly. Jonah looked at her, face lit by the orange flicker of the dying line. "It didn't," he said. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The fire line glowed faint and then went dark. Crickets started singing as if the world had exhaled. When he finally rose to go, he said only, "Tomorrow I'll fix the pump again." Fire cracked the pipe. She watched him walk out into the cooling dark, his shape swallowed by the smoke-hung light. When he was gone, she looked down at her hands, black, trembling, human. Then at the sundial on the porch rail, dusted with ash but unbroken. The cedar gnomon he'd made still stood upright, casting its small, perfect shadow by the fire's dying glow. It pointed east, toward morning. When morning came, the world was the color of cooled iron. Ash lay over the pasture like a pale frost, soft underfoot and scentless, a silence so wide it seemed holy. Miriam stepped outside barefoot, the boards cold against her soles. The windmill turned again, slow and obedient, each creak a weary hymn. She thought the land looked both older and cleaner, as if it had shed something it no longer wished to remember. Jonah was asleep on the porch, hat tipped over his eyes, boots still on. The fireline soot ran down his neck in crooked streaks. His horse stood tethered at the rail, ribs rising slow. For a moment she only watched him breathe. The sight of another life, still, unclaimed by smoke, brought a tremor to her chest she hadn't earned and didn't know how to quiet. She poured water into a tin cup and set it beside him. "You'll die of thirst before the day starts," she said. He stirred, blinking at the light. "Wouldn't be the worst way to go. Don't say foolish things in my yard." He smiled at that, slow and sleep-heavy. "It's a good yard, worth staying in." She turned from him, hiding the smile that rose and died before it reached her mouth. The pump groaned when she primed it. Water came out tasting faintly of smoke. She filled 2 buckets, poured them over the scorched fence posts, and felt the steam kiss her wrists. When she came back, he was standing now, studying the horizon. The charred ridge stretched north like a black scar. "You could have left," she said. "Riders like you don't stay for smoke." He shrugged. "Had nothing better to do." "That's not an answer." He looked down, thumb tracing the line of his glove. "Maybe I didn't want to see another thing burn alone." The words hung between them. She wanted to step closer, to tell him something kind, something that might turn those gray eyes softer. But her tongue stayed behind its fence. Instead, she said, "The cistern held. You'll need to patch that pipe like you promised." He gave a mock salute. "Yes, ma'am." They worked together most of the day. The sun came back gentle, as if apologizing. He dug and hammered. She steadied the joints and handed him nails, their fingers brushing once, twice, each time too brief to be an accident, too long to be nothing. When the job was done, they sat in the shade of the barn, sharing cold coffee from a jar. Flies droned. A breeze stirred the burnt grass into sighs. "I used to think fire was punishment," Miriam said quietly, "that it came for what we left undone. And now?" She looked out across the blackened field. "Now I think it's just the world remembering how to start again." He followed her gaze, then nodded. "Maybe people ain't so different." Evening came like mercy. They ate biscuits gone dry but sweet with honey. Neither spoke much. When the light thinned to blue, Jonah leaned back against the post and fell asleep, sitting up. Miriam watched the steady rise of his chest, the way his hand rested open on his knee like a question unanswered. She wanted to reach for it, to thank him, to tell him the truth, that she hadn't prayed in years, not until last night when the sky turned red and she thought she'd die with no one calling her name. But she didn't speak. Instead, she rose, covered him with an old quilt from the porch, and went inside. The sundial sat on the windowsill, the cedar gnomon now blackened at the tip, its small shadow slanting toward the hearth. For the first time since the fire, it pointed true. She whispered to it, "We're still here." And for once, time seemed to listen. 2 weeks passed before the grass grew its first timid green again. The land smelled of tin and soot, but the earth had softened, remembering rain. Jonah stayed through the mending season, helping without mention, sleeping some nights in the barn, some beneath the stars. His horse had come to know the yard as home, and so had he, though he never said the word. One afternoon, the telegraph line hummed faint and far, carrying talk from the depot 40 miles east. The railroad was hiring crews. Good pay, fresh country, a promise of motion. It was the sort of work Jonah once chased without thinking. Miriam heard it too. Even silence can feel when something changes in the air. That evening she found him sitting on the porch rail, a folded handbill in his palm. "They're building north," he said, eyes fixed somewhere between dusk and tomorrow. "Rails'll need laying. Foreman's paying $2 a day, meals included." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Then you'd best get going." He nodded slowly. "Suppose I should," but he didn't rise. The windmill turned behind them, its blades cutting the late light into pieces. She took a seat across from him, on the other side of the porch. The space between them filled with the smell of mesquite and something else, what you might call sorrow, if you had the courage to name it. "You ever think you stayed somewhere too long?" he asked. "I used to think that," she said. "Now I think maybe I left too soon." He looked down at the handbill, then folded it clean along its crease and tore it in half. "Guess I'll find out what it's like to finish something instead of start it." "You'll regret it," she said, but her voice betrayed her. He smiled a little, not to her, but to the wind. "Then I'll regret it beside you." For a while, neither spoke. The world felt balanced, fragile, suspended between one breath and the next. Finally, she stood. "There's supper inside if you want it, beans and bread." He followed her in. The kitchen smelled of warm salt and lamp oil. They ate slow, without talk, the clink of spoons filling what words could not. When the plates were cleared, Jonah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass watch. Its cover was cracked, the hands still. "Stopped it the day my brother died," he said. "Never wound it since. Guess I liked remembering him in that minute." She took the watch gently, held it to her ear. "Even stopped things can keep time," she said, and handed it back. He met her eyes then, steady, unashamed. "You'd have me stay?" She hesitated, fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I'd have you do what you can live with." He nodded, slow. "That's so." Outside, the first thunder rolled low across the plains. The sound trembled the lamp flame, made it bow. Jonah reached for his coat by the door, but instead of leaving, he hung it on the peg again. Miriam watched him, heart quiet but full. "Storm's comin'," she said. "Let it," he answered. They stood a moment longer, two shapes carved in lamplight. Then she turned the wick down, and the house fell into the soft dark of something about to change. In the window, the sundial caught a flicker of lightning, one bright pulse across its face. Then all was still. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, whispering their long-awaited news across the roof. Rain came steady through the night, soft as forgiveness, until morning turned the yard to a shallow mirror. Every hoofprint filled and shone. The world smelled new again, though newness is only another name for loss. Miriam stood on the porch with her arms folded, watching Jonah mend the fence where the post had split from the fire's heat. His shirt clung to his shoulders, dark from the rain. He worked like a man trying to outlast the weather, as if endurance could be a kind of prayer. She wanted to tell him to come inside. She didn't. The wanting itself felt like too much already. When the sun pushed through around noon, they ate cold biscuits in the doorway, boots dripping, silence passing between them with the calm of old habit. The rain had brought quiet news. The creek to the south had overflowed, and the road to Arroyo Lirio was washed out. The town was cut off. For a time, it was just them and the land again. She thought of that as a mercy. But mercy comes with its own price. By week's end, the ground hardened, and with it came the drought's truth. Half her seed spoiled in the barn, and the milk cow's udder ran near dry. The last bolt of cloth had gone to patchwork quilts. Her savings lay folded in a tobacco tin under the stove, thin as an old promise. She knew the math and what it meant, what she could afford and what she couldn't. That morning she walked the ridge where the fire had passed and found Jonah already there, watching the horizon as if waiting for it to blink. She held the sundial in her hand, its chain cut clean, bronze glinting in the sun. "I can't pay you anymore," she said simply. He turned, confusion in his eyes. "Didn't ask for pay." "I know, but if you stay, it'll feel like debt, and I've lived long enough with those." He started to answer, then stopped when he saw the sundial in her palm. "You keep that," he said softly. "I made it right again." "It's yours," she said, pressing it into his hand. Time belongs to the young. He shook his head. Not sure I am anymore. You're younger than the ghosts that live here, she said. Take it. It'll point better for you. He looked down at the bronze face, the small cedar wedge still darkened at the tip. His thumb brushed the chain where she'd cut it. You're giving me your father's dial? I'm giving it to someone who might still need to measure the sun. Wind moved through the burnt grass, low and mournful. He wanted to speak, to tell her that the measure of time had already changed, that the light didn't fall the same since he'd found her porch. But the words stayed where men keep what they fear will sound foolish. So he said instead, You'll be all right? I've been all right, she said, though her voice carried the faint crack of something bending. He nodded, slipping the sundial into his coat pocket. Then, because leaving without touch felt like another kind of cruelty, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Her fingers were cool, dry as seed husks, but they closed around his as if remembering how. I'll ride back when the creek settles, he said. You'll ride back when you must, she corrected. He smiled, barely. Yes, ma'am. He swung onto his horse, boots wet against the stirrups. The air shimmered between them, bright and empty. She stood and watched him ride out across the flats until the dust swallowed the sound of hooves. Only then did she kneel, pressing her palm into the blackened earth where the fire had kissed it bare. The ground was warm still, faintly alive. She whispered to the soil, He'll come back. The land gave no answer. It never does. Back at the house, the windmill turned slow, creaking like an old memory refusing to die. On the porch rail, the place where the sundial had sat was clean now, an absence bright as faith itself. Miriam Vale stood there until the sun dropped and the first star trembled over the ridge. Her hand found her pocket. Empty, and somehow that felt right. The days came quiet again, drawn long and thin. The world smelled of dust and pine resin, the air steady as an old man's breath. Jonah Cates did not return that week, nor the next, though his name hung in the house like wood smoke, something seen even after it's gone. Miriam Vale rose before dawn each morning, tending to chores she no longer needed to hurry through. A woman's work, she thought, was mostly learning to begin again without an audience. The land healed where the fire had run. Tiny shoots pushed through the black soil, small miracles that didn't ask to be noticed. The windmill still turned, uneven, faithful. When she listened, its creak reminded her of a heartbeat finding its strength again. One morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, she took a basket and walked to the far fence. The grass there was short and silver, the air full of that faint chill before warmth begins. The pocket where the sundial had lain was empty, but her hand still went there out of habit. It felt less like loss now, more like proof that she'd had something worth missing. When she reached the old gate, she saw movement by the rise, something small and deliberate. A horse stood there, reins looped over the post. No rider. She felt her chest tighten, half hope, half fear. Then Jonah stepped from behind the bluff, hat in his hand, the light just breaking over his shoulder. He looked thinner, older somehow, the kind of tired that comes not from work, but from deciding. Thought the road might have forgotten me, she said, voice barely above the wind. It almost did, he said. Creek took the bridge. Took me 3 days to find a crossing. She nodded once, not trusting herself to say more. He came closer until the distance between them was only what decency required. His hand went to his pocket. I brought this back, he said. The sundial lay there in his palm, warm from his touch. The cedared gnomon was darker now, smoothed at the edges by travel. Didn't tell the right time for me neither, he said. Guess it only ever meant something here. She took it from him, the weight familiar and new at once. Maybe time don't belong to either of us, she said. Maybe it just passes through. He smiled at that, slow and certain. "Then I reckon I'll let it pass here a while." They stood together, watching the first light climb the far slope. The wind was soft, carrying the smell of wet sage and the faint, sweet promise of rain. Behind them, the windmill turned steady as a vow. Miriam looked toward the horizon where the sky burned gold, then back at the man beside her. "It's a fine thing," she said quietly, "to still have mornings left." Jonah nodded. "It is." They didn't speak again. Words would have only disturbed what had already settled right. Later, when the sun stood high, she set the sundial on the porch rail once more. The cedar gnomon caught the light and threw a thin, perfect shadow across the wood. It pointed true, east to west, like forgiveness finally remembering where to go. She smiled, small and private, and when the wind picked up, carrying the dry scent of a land alive again, Miriam Vale closed her eyes and whispered the line she'd never meant to say aloud. "You think I'm too old?" The wind, warm and certain, moved through her hair like an answer. "I think you're just in time."